for a number of reasons. But certainly I've been in and out of the life of Good Shepherd here quite a bit in the last 2 years, 2+ years. And you've seen me around at various meetings, events, and also I served here just right after Pastor Spencer's stroke. You might remember I was here for a month or 6 weeks until we were able to engage the services of Pastor Bassett as the interim pastor during that time. So it's my pleasure to be here today. Pastor Richter, my partner in crime, has warned me in advance that you've got all kinds of questions and concerns, and he said, and he was intentional apparently of not answering any of them for you last week. He said, just talk to Scott, talk to Scott. I said, well, thanks for setting me up that way, Aaron. So anyway, it's my pleasure to be here today and to kind of engage in this conversation. As we start, or before we start, I'd like to call us into a time of prayer. Almighty God, we thank you for this chance to worship together this morning. We know that this parish has been struggling for some time now. As Pastor Spencer suffered from his stroke and cancer, they tried to find a pathway forward to walk together, and now they bid farewell to him and are very intentionally searching for that next leader that you might raise up. We pray for the good people here that you would keep them strong in their faith. We pray for the leaders of the congregation that they would be filled with imagination and courage. And we pray that you might identify that pastor, that leader who will stand among this congregation in the days ahead to guide and to lead and to care for the people here and to orchestrate the ministry among this community. We ask this in Jesus' name. Well, I'm not quite sure where to begin exactly, but let me just say a few things. And I want to make certain that I'm able to respond to and answer questions that you guys might have. Make sure that we have some answers, or if we don't have answers, at least a commitment to find answers to some of the questions that you might have about what's going on and where that's going. Let me start by just saying a few things that I think I know. And if what I think I know isn't right, let me know, okay? Because I'm sort of operating at a certain mindset. What I think I know right now is that Good Shepherd is suffering in a couple ways. You have experienced some decline, some statistical declines in the last 2.5 years. I understand that in terms of worship attendance and stuff like that. And that, I'll be honest, I know shakes up people and strikes fear in our hearts. The congregation and the ministries that you love and have been such a vital part of who you are and what you're all about and how you live out God's intention for this community seem to be very vulnerable. And I understand that anxiety, and that's legitimate. I would also say that any congregation that enters into a pastoral vacancy, it would not be uncommon to see a 15% shift in giving patterns and in worship attendance. Not that that's a good thing, but it's in part to be expected. When it doesn't happen, didn't happen in Ramsey, that's very unusual. It's more common to see that kind of stuff. So I'm aware that is creating some anxiety here and a growing sense that says this can't be tolerated much longer. And so I understand that. That's one thing that I think I know. Another thing that I think I know is that there's confusion about how long you've been in vacancy. And here's kind of where we are with that. You know that Pastor Spencer, upon suffering his stroke, really was not able to continue to serve in the fashion and ways that he did prior to that. That was February 2 years ago. There was some hopefulness at the very beginning that he might recover from the stroke. We learned later that there were some other medical issues that were prohibiting that from happening. We didn't know that right at the time. There was, as I say, always kind of this hopefulness that he might return and remain strong in his work among you as he had served for a few decades. As we grew deeper into that process, it kind of became obvious that that was not necessarily going to be able to happen. The leadership of this congregation, along with the office of the bishop, had been engaging in some rather bold and sometimes very forthright, almost in-your-face kind of conversations about whether or how Pastor Spencer might continue or not continue as pastor of this church. We obviously made certain that Pastor Bassett was brought on board in order to provide day-to-day and ongoing kind of pastoral leadership among you during this time. He came on as your interim pastor. As we went further down this road, it looked like Pastor Spencer might resign and officially step away from his responsibilities here, and then details didn't come together. And at the end, he retired just last February. And so, in some ways, in the office of the bishop, Bishop Bartholomew says, well, the pastoral vacancy began here at Good Shepherd Church earlier this year. And you've gone about 6 months down the road so far right now in your pastoral transition. For some of you, I know, or I believe, you were saying, no, that pastoral vacancy and transition really started a long time ago. I think in some ways it's both. It was difficult to, or the bishop really could not start a more diligent search for a pastoral candidate and so forth until Pastor Spencer actually vacated the parsonage and the office. The office in my mind is the kind of telling one. Pastor Spencer's things were still in that office right up until very end. Nevertheless, where we are right now is engaged in a diligent search to find a pastor for Good Shepherd Church. And I think that's the important thing that I want to focus on. We can quibble over, sort of when the vacancy started and whether the bishop was, or the office of the bishop has been attentive to your needs and so forth. Please understand as well that some of that frustration towards the office of the bishop we expect and we see all the time as congregations grieve the departure of a long-serving, beloved pastor. Who do you get mad at? The bishop's always a good choice. We kind of understand. But I want to also fill you in a bit on where we stand right now with the call process and with the search for a new pastor to serve Good Shepherd Church. Soon after Pastor Spencer retired, we were able to nominate a candidate to the call committee. The way this works is you have a call committee of 6 people, and whenever the bishop identifies a candidate that she believes is a suitable and appropriate pastoral candidate, she will nominate that person and submit their biographical information and so forth to the call committee. That call committee is charged with the responsibility of doing these kind of initial screening of the candidate and the initial interviews and so forth of that particular pastor. And they as I say, sort of do that initial screening of the person and say, yes, this looks like this might be a viable person to be among us. They then, if they feel that, will move that candidate to an interview with the church council. As the church council conducts their interview, they again will make a similar determination. And if the church council believes that this is the pastor who will lead you into the next chapter of your congregation's life, they will then bring that candidate to the congregation. So it's a sort of a four-step process. It's the bishop, the call committee, the council, the congregation. The bishop had identified a candidate, I don't know, a few weeks, I believe, after Pastor Spencer had left, and passed that name along to the call committee. The call committee pawed through the pastor's materials. They were very diligent and purposeful in the work that they did. They prepared good questions for the candidate, gave the candidate a tour of the neighborhood, and conducted their interview. They heard the pastor. They heard Pastor Creed. They did not do Pastor Creed. But they elected not to do that simply because at the end of the interview, the call committee felt that this was not going to be a matchup here that was going to be sort of life-giving for both pastor and the congregation, at least not for the congregation. And so the call committee said, this is not the pastor for us, and so that pastor came out of the call process. So that was the call committee up to this point has interviewed one person. Okay. On our side in the office of the bishop, we have continued to search for a pastor here. We have shared your ministry site profile, which is this like 16-page document, which outlines a lot of stuff about the community of Glen Rock as well as the congregation here. We have shared that ministry site profile with 3 pastors in addition to the original candidate. When the bishop interviews a candidate or whatever and says, I believe this pastor could serve us well at Good Shepherd, she will then share the ministry site profile. The pastor gets to review that paperwork, and if the pastor is intrigued enough to engage in an interview, they would be nominated into the process. If the pastor looks at the paperwork and says, I don't think this is the place for me, or I don't think this is going to be a good matchup, or whatever, they can say, well, no, thank you, I don't care to pursue that. We have shared the ministry site profile of Good Shepherd Church with 3 pastors, in addition to the original candidate that was given to us. So it's 4 different pastors. The most recent pastor received your ministry site profile last week. So we had 2 pastors after the original candidate. There were 2 more pastors who got a look at your ministry site profile. Neither of those pastors wanted to interview. And so, you know, we can't make a pastor interview here or any other place. And so they declined, and so we continued to search. Last week, we shared your ministry site profile with another pastor, and I woke up this morning and have a text message from that pastor that says, can you give me a call? I'd like to talk about Good Shepherd. Now, I don't know where that's going, but it says to me at least that that pastor has obviously read your materials now and is saying, Scott, I want to ask you some questions and learn a little bit more about Good Shepherd. So that's where we stand in terms of the search process and the identification of the candidate. During that time as well, you also, your call committee sent out a letter to all of your former interns suggesting that either they or maybe some of their colleagues and friends that they know or whatever might be interested in considering Good Shepherd as an opportunity for their next call. And so that letter went out to all those folks. I think it was a good faith effort on the part of the call committee to try to identify or maybe shake loose some possible pastoral candidates that we were not considering or not aware of in the process. At the end of the day, it didn't accomplish that. It didn't do that. But it was, it was worth the effort, and I think to try to be able to identify some folks who were available to us. So that's kind of where we are in terms of the call process at the moment. We continue to kind of look and so forth. Not to make excuses, but just to give you a little bit of reality about what we're up against here. Your congregation is looking for a pastor who might be, I guess in some ways, considered sort of a second call pastor, somebody who has 4 or 5 years experience under their belt already. You're not looking for a brand new pastor right out of seminary. So you're looking for that person who's maybe served their first church, gained a little bit more experience and maturity, and is now ready to step into something a little bit larger. And so we try to honor that as best we can. We honor it for 2 reasons. One, out of respect for you, this is what you're asking for. And number 2, oftentimes, when we look at the amount of experience that a pastor has, the less experience a pastor has, generally, the less expensive the pastor is to the congregation. And we certainly know, if you sort of roll your memory back 2.5 years ago, that's when you guys, I think, clearly understood that your current form of ministry or model that you were using at that moment was not sustainable financially. And I think you enacted a 10% across the board cut of all staff positions and some other stuff like that. And so we understand that there were some financial constraints historically that were there, and we need to be attentive to that as well. We don't want to unnecessarily jam up a congregation by bringing in a candidate that's not appropriate for them. If we identify a candidate who might have a little bit more experience or something like that, we would certainly come back and speak with you about that. But before nominating that person, we will ask. So if a pastor comes in with 25 years experience and he says, wow, we have a great candidate, but it might cost you this much money, before we would even nominate that person, we would ask and say, if it's the right pastor, could you find a way to make that possible? So that's kind of where we are in the process here. We don't have, I'll be honest with you, we don't have a lot of pastors in that sort of 5, 7, 8 year kind of experience. We're fishing in a pretty small pond there, at least inside New Jersey. We're not limited only to New Jersey. We look at candidates from outside the synod as well. An interesting sort of fact, if you might be interested in or not, 2/3 of the pastors in the New Jersey Synod are over 50 years of age. And so when we're talking about pastors who, have been out there 5 to 8 years or something like that, that's a small group. The scary thing for me, and I think for the bishop, is that if 2/3 of our pastors are 50 or older, in the next 10 to 15 years, we are going to see a huge number of our pastors retire. And we just don't have young pastors coming behind us right now. So it's not that they're not there. We just need to be patient in our search and hopefully be able to identify that candidate that's going to work for the church. So let me be quiet now. That's just a little bit of background and some stuff that I think is going on. And I want to hear from you. What are some of your concerns, questions, whatever? If I can answer them, I'd love to hear. Yes.
When we were talking this morning, you mentioned 2 things about possibly, if need be, changing our criteria, and also the sharing of a pastor with another church who also searches for a pastor. Are those possibilities that we might have to consider at some point, or?
Yeah, maybe at some point. Personally, I don't think that I would rush to that right now. I think if we're just absolutely stuck for an extended period of time, we might have to look at things and say, is there need to do something differently? This is a congregation that has a huge budget. Okay, there's no reason that you would not be able to afford a full-time pastor. I would think. And so I'm not sure that at this point in time to make that kind of switch would be prudent or something that I would recommend. I think it just takes time. To be honest with you, the average in the New Jersey Synod, it is not uncommon to see a congregation in a pastoral transition to go 6 to 18 months before they find a pastor. I wish it were quicker, but that is 6 to 18 months is pretty much average in the New Jersey Synod. From the time when Pastor Spencer moved his books and stuff out of the office until now is a little over 6 months.
So it could be another year?
It could be, but I hope it's not.
Right.
I mean, we are really struggling. The other thing that, yeah, it could be. I can't promise anything other than I can promise that we continue and faithfully are looking for a pastor here. And given the circumstances here at Good Shepherd, we are really trying to move this forward as best we're able to do that. You're also in an interesting situation because of the way in which Pastor Spencer left. Typically what we would do in the New Jersey Synod, if we had a pastor who served the congregation for 30 years, when that pastor leaves, we would bring in an intentional interim pastor who would serve from 1 to 2 years in that congregation. Because for 3 decades, the congregations never had any other pastor. The congregation in situations like that really doesn't know who they are apart from that pastor. And so there's a lot of grieving that takes place, and that doesn't happen immediately. It sort of is discovered along the way, 6 months after it's sort of like the next Advent after the pastor retires or leaves. It's like, who orders the candles for the Advent wreath? I don't know, are we supposed to order those? And you suddenly discover all sorts of little dumb things that kind of jump up and get you when you don't expect it, and so forth. In a case like Good Shepherd, you were coming off of a time of some significant financial difficulties. Under other circumstances, had Pastor Spencer just simply retired prior to having a stroke or something like that, we would have brought that interim pastor in. That interim pastor would have been very intentional in looking at some of those matters of grief, some of those matters of saying, if we've got some financial hardships and so forth, what do we need to be looking at? How are we spending our money? Is our staff too big? Is it too small? Should we keep the intern? A lot of different things like that that you might have normally addressed during that intentional interim period, sort of giving the congregation an opportunity to identify and groom and equip good lay leadership, to reset some priorities, which are the priorities of the church for the pastors, which ones are really owned by the congregation. All those sort of things normally happen in an intentional interim time. I'm not sure you were able to accomplish all of those things with Pastor Bassett here. That is not a judgment on him or on you. It was just a different circumstance. Pastor Bassett was the interim that saw you through the departure of Pastor Spencer. He was not the interim who came in after, that had happened and the dust had settled. And so we're at a slightly different place with you, but we're not going to, I know the bishop is not intending to say, well, now they're ready for a 2-year interim. Okay? No, we understand that some of that interim work that normally might have happened was not able to happen, but that's okay. We're going to try to get a full-time regularly called pastor in here as quickly as we possibly can. And so we continue that search and continue that to look for that pastor who's going to be able to do that way. So I would not back off of who you are and what you're looking for at this point in time. I don't think it's time to panic yet, so yeah. But certainly, I think for all of us, and to maybe extrapolate a little bit of what you brought up, for all of our churches, it is increasingly important for our churches to kind of look at who they are and how we have shaped and formed our ministry, and continue to look at, does that need to be in some ways adapted or changed or amended as we move deeper into the 21st century. This is, Good Shepherd is, a congregation which has clearly sort of prospered and served you well and engaged the neighborhood from in the model of a rather traditional, almost 20th century church. That's not a bad thing, okay? However, times are changing, people are attentive. So we want to watch for the signs, like in the sermon, watching for the signs, and then how do we respond because of the signs that we see? How do we do that faithfully? Sometimes that means some change in transition. But at this point, I wouldn't, upset the apple cart and say, and now for something completely different. That's not faithful to who you are at this point, or what you believe is going to work for you as you move forward, at least in the next few years. Some other questions?
Do you think that a pastor would be attracted to this congregation if we were more deliberate about expressing our openness to different forms of ministry, 21st century type of ministry, and so on, rather than giving a perception of people looking for a pastor who, in a sense, follow the kinds of things that we traditionally do?
Yes. And let me expand on that a little bit. Especially since if you're looking for a pastor on the younger side of things, sort of that second call pastor, these are folks who are in their 30s, okay? So think about when they were born, all right? They're not people who are 60, all right? They're not people who came out of the seminary in the late 70s or early 80s and so forth. These are folks who've come out of the seminary within the last 10 years, last 5 to 10 years. Those folks are probably, simply because they're millennials, and they're wired differently than you and I are. And they are interested in, I think, probably some experimentation. I mean, not to blow everything up, but interested in some experimentation and trying to find some fresh and new ways to kind of engage the community around them. The example I would hold up is Jenny McClellan in Allendale, one of your neighbors. I don't know if you know anything about Jenny McClellan. Maybe you've read about her in the newspapers. That's where I usually see. But Jenny's ordained 3 years. Maybe 4 now. Okay. When I first met Pastor McClellan, she was still a student at Luther Seminary. She had a bright red spiked hair with, piercings, and I looked at Bishop Riley and said, "You're going to send her that one day." I mean, it's a little more buttoned down than Jenny was. Jenny adapted a lot when she came out of seminary and so forth. She's really grown in the position that she has. But Jenny also engages that community in ways that are far different than any of her predecessors did. You see her in the newspaper, it's usually because she's sitting at the Starbucks with her laptop working on her sermon and a cup of coffee next to her and a sign sitting on the table, where she's at, that says, "May I pray with you?" And she does that like twice a week. She just sits there for 2 hours and works on her sermons and catches up on her emails. And apparently folks actually come over and say, "Could you pray for my sick cousin?" And they sit down and they talk and so she's engaging the world differently than, my dinosaur generation ever did. We were never taught in seminary to be a pastor in that way. So we're going to see, some new engagement. I think, and so I'm not suggesting that Good Shepherd blow up or deny who you are. That doesn't, we need to be respectful of who you are. Gosh, this is a good, strong church. You've got a good reputation and so forth. You're in some hard times right now. We don't want to disrespect that. We want to honor that and bring forward the best that Good Shepherd has to offer. At the same time, I think it's fair to say, and by the way, we're willing to be open to try a new thing every now and again. Cool. And I think particularly for some of our younger pastors, if they feel that there's that freedom or that ability willingness to experiment, that's kind of cool. You've got other great things going for you. Good school systems, you've got parsonage. You know, quite honestly, if you were a congregation in Bergen County without a parsonage, oh, God help you. Because, you know, for a young pastor, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years experience to come and buy a home in the Bergen County area is almost prohibitive. And so there's a lot of things you got going for you. It's just about finding that right person who's interested in moving and all that kind of stuff. So that's really what we're looking for. Yes.
I think in some ways we do know about the younger pastors and their thinking with the interns we've had recently.
Okay.
Certainly, many of their ways were new to us.
Yep.
Sometimes it was shocking, but we got used to it. So then we moved forward. So I
And they
think
did too. They really benefited from your
yes, I think in a
tutoring
way
here.
we are aware of those things. We're not just looking for dinosaurs.
Don't look
Whatever.
at dinosaurs.
I also think that
They went extinct for a reason.
I think the most important, accepting of the various changes that have brought into our church. And you are right about the anxiety that we are experiencing. What are some positive things? Are there any negative things that perhaps could be holding us back? That you might suggest we adapt or change to?
You know, I'm not seeing any glaring things that have popped up there. I think, the one pastor that I spoke with shared some of her anxieties about following a pastor who served as long as Pastor served. We can't do anything about that. Okay. That's just and it's a fair question for any pastor who interviews here. Is, you know, and I think that's where, you know, the call committee. I think the call committee did a very fine job because their first candidate did ask some of these questions. You know, insofar as the call committee was very clear that we're not looking for a Roger Spencer replacement. Okay. We're looking for a pastor who's going to get you down the road here from 2016 forward. Not somebody who's going to come in and do it like Pastor Spencer did. Okay? And so I think the call committee did a good job of communicating that to the candidate. And I don't sense in your ministry site profile that you have that intention as you seek your next pastor, to say we need to find a replacement for Roger. That's not what you're after. As a matter of fact, I think one of the things that jumps out at me a little bit is I think it's not a hole or a deficiency, but in the description of where you are at the moment, one of the things that pops up in the MSP is we're not certain what our goals are for 2020 or beyond. And I get that. You have, for a couple of reasons. One, you had a pastor here who was long serving, and some of the goals, direction, and momentum was driven by the pastor, always is. So he could become sort of the default person in setting some of the direction. Number two, you entered into this 2-year sort of leave taking that was just this time of great uncertainty. And so there's not these, here's the 3 things that we expect to accomplish by the year 2020. That's not in your ministry cycle. That's not bad. That's, I think, an accurate reflection of who you are and the needs that you have right now. You do reflect, we've got some folks here who can lead and who are good workers, but at the moment, it's tough for us to put together a plan until we have some of those goals well articulated and internalized. That's probably going to be in part job 1 after you get to learn who the people are and listen and so forth. But that's going to be one of the early jobs of any pastor who comes here. That I don't think is a negative. I don't think it's going to drive people off. Particularly, it may actually excite some people who are saying, you know what, I could really make a difference here. And this could be fun, trying to figure this out and set the plans in place, and let's go get it. This, you know, and so if you've got a pastor who's wired that way, this could be a very attractive congregation. It's a matter of getting us, you know, which pastor's wired that way? Are they ready and willing to move right now? You know, and I'll be honest, there's another dynamic. As some of you know, I'm directing this program for the New Jersey Synod called EMU, Excellence in Ministry Unleashed. It's a program funded by the Lilly Endowment, and it deals with helping pastors address their own personal financial realities and so on. We are in a time, in a culture right now, where the church requires of our pastors that they have in their back pocket a rather expensive theological education in order to be a pastor in this church. I mean, besides your master's degree, you've got to go to the seminary. This is a 4-year program. There's an internship involved. Oftentimes those internships and so forth. And so our pastors are leaving the seminary, many of them with huge educational debts. $100,000, $150,000 when you figure in their undergrad stuff. And so these young pastors are landing in congregations, and they have these significant financial obligations already, you know, encumbering that. For pastors who are married, increasingly we're finding that the spouse of the pastor has the primary income. Pastors may start at whatever it is, $43,000 a year base salary or something like that, but their chances of growing that into a $90,000 a year job are pretty slim. Okay, and so frequently, you know, the pastor's spouse might have the primary income. When that happens, pastors become increasingly reluctant to relocate. Because the minute they move, I mean, it used to be just, oh, do we pull the kids out of school, out of the school that they love and away from their friends and move to a new community. But now it's also, you know, if I move more than 35 miles down the road, my spouse just lost her job. And she's the primary breadwinner. And so pastors sometimes are reluctant to move. So all those dynamics feed into that. So it's a matter of getting all those pieces to come together at the right time. Pastors' willingness to be called from wherever they're currently serving to this place. You know, what's it look like inside their own household, and is this the right congregation, and so forth. So that's why it takes time, and it's a little bit hard. Yes?
Pastor, has the bishop and staff ever considered in these changing times and just what you described with difficulties with loans and relocation and spouse jobs, the idea of better vetting candidates to seminary to understand what life is going to be like, and possibly even a situation where they would be placed rather than be asked where to go? I know that's fairly draconian, but I'm just curious, you know.
Yes. The EMU project that I'm currently directing addresses some of those financial realities straight up on the front end. We have already this year conducted a retreat specifically targeted to our seminary candidates. These are folks who are still in seminary, trying to talk about some of the economic realities that are out there that they need to be paying attention to and the ways in which that impacts their household finances, their own ability to talk about money, to manage funds, their own financial literacy. And so in addition to that, the EMU project is going to make available to our pastors some financial relief or financial assistance in meeting their loan obligations on their educational debt. And so we're trying to address those areas on the front end as best as we are able to do that, as well as prepare them for the fact, particularly our younger pastors, knowing that 2/3 of our pastors will likely retire in the next 10 to 20 years, to sort of alert them to the fact that a 2-point parish may be in their future, okay, and so forth. So we are trying to be honest about that, and to not only just share that news, but to accompany them in some positive ways to assist them in navigating those waters. We are working at that. Regarding the sort of the placement of pastors, our polity does not allow us at this time to say to one pastor, we can't go to Pastor Hartney in St. Paul's and Beechwood and say, Peter, you need to put your house on the market because in 6 weeks we expect you up at Glenrock and we're relocating you there. We don't have the ability to do that. Now, but in some ways we've gotten closer to that. In the old days, you kind of, well, there was a lot of things different in the old days. It doesn't matter, but pastors now, as they come through the seminary, go into a thing called the assignment, and pastors, as pastors come through the system now, they can say, I'd like to serve in Region 7. They don't even get to identify the synod. They can say, I want to serve in Region 7. Region 7 is what we're in. It's north and southeast. It's eastern side of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all of New York, and New England. That's Region 7. And so a pastor can say, well, I'd really like to go to New Jersey, but the best I can do is say Region 7 is my first choice. Now, that pastor might get assigned to Region 2. There's no guarantee just because they say they want to go to Region 7 that they will. And the reason that they did that is because, nobody wanted to go to really Nebraska in the winter. And so the bishops in Nebraska were saying, oh man, we never get any seminarians. Nobody wants to go to Alaska. So, and so now they assign graduating seminarians to a region. And so they may or may not even want to be in this region. But then as the bishops get together, they say, well, we have 12 seminarians who've been assigned to us, and we get to divide them up between north and southeastern Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Metro New York, upstate New York, and New England. And we got 12, so we each get 2. And that's how they end up here, okay? Now, once they're in a call, we can't just pull a pastor out and we can encourage them, and we do. We've approached a number of our pastors and said, got this great congregation, I'd like you to look at the MSP. Here's why we think it would be a great opportunity for you and for the congregation. Take a look at this, we'll talk about it. So we do that kind of stuff. But if they say, this is not the time to move, my daughter has 2 more years at the high school she's in, I am not moving her until she's out of school. We can't make that pastor. But we are proactive. We don't just sit back and say, well, I wonder if somebody's going to drop out of the sky. We do try to search and look. And the search is not only inside New Jersey, but if we know of somebody has recommended someone from outside the synod, or if someone from another synod would like to move to New Jersey, our bishop will find out about that. She will interview them and say, wow, this is somebody we really like in New Jersey. And let's send them the MSP and it'll turn out to be a great match. So that's how that goes.
Would there be much more flexibility if there's some focus on recent seminary graduates who have not yet established themselves in unity, established I know that the call committee is focusing on the second call.
Yeah.
But I've been some young recent seminary graduates who have great track record. because they're having the same kind of experience in some ways.
Yes.
That second.
Actually, your first candidate was a second career visit.
Well, I guess my hope, and I'm not talking to anybody involved with me on this, and I don't want to disagree.
No, it was just a second call pastor who actually fit in the, whatever you were looking for. I don't remember the exact numbers, 5 to 8 years or something like that. This pastor fit into that bracket, but was second career, so they were older. They brought a level of maturity to the table that you might not find in the 30-year-old pastor.
I guess my only point is, I would hope we would be open to individuals.
Sure.
Outstanding individuals come along and not doing us.
Other questions that I could answer for you?
Recently, Pastor, I've seen that pastors that have relocated to New Jersey, understandably so, are more interested in establishing some kind of equity base as opposed to living in the parsonage. They've made some kind of financial relationship with their congregation where they buy a house, the mortgage might share in some way with the congregation. And so that in the end, what might be seen that occurred to Pastor Spencer, where his retirement meant he's leaving his community, where they would prefer to have some kind of fixed base in their own home. That being said, I know you alluded to this before as a positive thing, but you see the fact that we have parsonage and we're offering the parsonage as a blessing or a burden?
I see it as a blessing. About half of our congregations still have a parsonage. Half do not. There's a couple growing trends, I think. Number one, I think in our most impoverished, I think a parsonage is still an asset on the two extremes of our economic spectrum. In our most impoverished communities and in our more affluent communities, having a parsonage is an asset. Because, in the impoverished communities, if we're looking at, whatever, Camden or something like that, for the pastor to know that there is a residence available to them that's safe, warm, and dry is important. Because, many pastors are not particularly interested in investing in real estate in Camden. On the affluent side, pastors can't crack into the market. And so what we're seeing, pastors who are in some of our, not even necessarily affluent communities, but increasingly we're seeing pastors who are just renting a townhouse someplace or a condo because they can't get into the housing market. Building equity is a sketchy thing in some ways. First of all, you got to get into the market to be able to build up some equity. And then it depends, sometimes the equity or the fact that they're in the house holds them there. I know we have some pastors who are saying, I'd consider moving, but I bought at the peak, okay? I bought my house in, 2005, and I paid a small fortune for it. And if I sell it now, I'll have to bring my checkbook to the closing as the seller, because my house isn't worth what it once was. I'm a great case in point on that. My house is worth, it was just reassessed and so forth, in the town where I live. My house is worth $60,000 less than what I paid for it. Unfortunately, I'm not selling it, but there's my down payment gone. All right. Now, that's just kind of the reality of the housing markets and stuff. And so I know we have some pastors who are sitting there saying, if I sold my house right now, I'd take a bath. Or I'd walk away, and now I don't have a down payment for the next one anyway, and so forth. So I'm going to sit tight. And so all those things kind of factor into that. Actually, having the parsonages in a community like this is not completely bad. Millennials increasingly are very happy to rent, or happier to rent than the older pastors were, who were looking for a place that they could, where they could build some equity. And part of that is just the face of economics in America has changed. back in the day, pastors deeply desired to own their own home for two reasons. Number one, they didn't have to pay income tax on their housing loans, and they could deduct the interest on their mortgage. Wow, pastors got a double dip from the IRS. Okay, most parishioners don't know that, but pastors got a double dip. Okay, and so that was great. In addition to that, there was no place that you could put money that would appreciate as rapidly as real estate back in the day. It's a different day. And so things have changed a bit. So it actually is easier for us in some ways to entice pastors to take a look at congregations that have a parsonage available, as opposed to saying you're going to have to purchase something, find a rental property when you get there. So it's a mixed bag, and it's a changing environment for both pastors and congregations.
Pastor Bassett's contract goes through, I think, March or something. Has been renewed like each March or something.
Yeah.
If we're still about to break a new pastor and he said, well, 3 years is enough for me, so I'm going to retire up to
Again.
my vacation home, what do we do then? Does another interim pastor come in?
Yes. If March is the date, and maybe I don't know off the top of my head, but if March is the end time on his current contract as a pastor, and at the end of March he says, as you say, I'm going to the Cape. I just, I'm going to go up there and enjoy it, and Suzanne's retiring, and whatever they're going to do. We would do two things. Number one, if at all possible, we would try to bring in another interim pastor to give you that consistency and that level of pastoral care and leadership. Worst case scenario is we would identify a vice pastor who would be available to visit the sick and the homebound and, be at your council meetings and tend to just some routine pastoral care. Vice pastors are neighboring pastors who kind of do this in their spare time. They earn like $500 a month to do that. It just basically provides basic pastoral care. Does not really provide you with the kind of leadership that Pastor Bassett is able to provide right now. So our first choice would be to find an interim pastor. If we would fail at that, minimally you would have some pastor available to you to do that, and you would have supply pastors in the facility. We really don't want that. We really want to have a pastor. That's what we really want. And so we're working hard at making that happen. So that's what would happen in a case like this. Stay strong in this struggle. I know it's hard, and it's hard to be patient. I get that. But know that we're working at it. And who knows, when I get home today and call this pastor, maybe we'll say, wow, this sounds really great. What do I have to do to schedule an interview? In which case we'll get in touch with Katie right away and we'll set something up here. So just know that we are working at it. I wish, there was the day when I was younger, there was the day when, we'd have 2-3 pastors calling the bishop saying, any chance I can interview over there at Glenville? It's just not happening. We're in a different day. Mobility is tight. And so it's one of the biggest challenges, I think, that Bishop Bartholomew has right now, is to find those kinds of pastors who are going to serve you well as we move forward. We keep working hard at it as best we can. So and I was going to say, I know the letters went out to the former interns that really did not, as far as I know, it generated 2 phone conversations, if you really want to know. I don't know if the bishop received anything. I got 2 phone calls as a result of the letters that you sent out. The one question, they both were kind of questions. The one was, Yes, I know. And so those were the only 2 phone calls that generated to my desk, at least. And I'm not aware that you received any response at all. So it's not that, it's just, I think it just didn't catch anybody at this moment in time. But I think it was worth the effort to reach out. You guys are very well networked. You've got sort of spies out there in the congregations all over the place, in New Jersey and other places as well. And that's really cool. What a great testament to the training and mentoring that this congregation has provided for a whole host of good pastors in our church. So God bless you for that work that you guys did. So it was worth reaching out to them, but it just didn't generate the results that we hoped for. Well, thank you. Got other questions you want to ask me privately? I'll stick around for a few minutes, and but thanks for being attentive, and I hope I've answered all of your questions. So you know how to get in touch with me.